So on that note, Cheryl, fantastic to have you here today. Really interested in your topic of conversation and its and your presentation. And you can see there, I'm actually genuinely now looking at the not often and rarely. It's very, very high numbers. What's your view on that? Are you shocked? Are you appalled? Or are
No,
you a bit of both?
I'm outraged. I'm outraged that many of I work with a lot of different campuses, and many of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are very narrowly focused. And even if they're narrowly focused on, let's say, race and ethnicity, they don't include disability. And so people from those two groups are not welcome into those efforts.
Yes.
And that is the most upsetting to me. I'd like diversity to always include disability, even as a separate measure of underrepresentation, but to not include a group as important as people with disabilities within your group. And the response I often get is, well, we don't really know much about disability, or we're not really prepared to deal with that. Well, there are ways to get prepared. And one of the first things, as was mentioned in the last presentation, is maybe you should have some people with disabilities from the racial and ethnic groups you're working with join your team.
Absolutely.
And begin
And
there.
I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think even from my own experiences, like it's great to have them even test things, because just doing technical tests isn't good enough, to make sure they have a good experience. But on that note, Cheryl, I don't want to ease into your time. We will talk again at the end of the panel discussion. But I'll pass over to you for your fantastic presentation.
Okay. Well, I think this fits right in with what we've been talking about here. And I'm going to talk about pursuing universal accessibility in digital assessment. I'm Sheryl Burgstahler. I'm from the University of Washington. And the type of assessment I'll be talking about is not just the standardized large-scale exams, but I work most often with individual faculty members on designing assessments. And guess what? Particularly in online learning these days. So I have a mix of things here, but I'm going to focus on a framework that we can all use for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts of all underrepresented groups. So I run 2 units as part of Accessible Technology Services at the University of Washington. I'm the director of the IT accessibility team. That's our group that's funded by the University of Washington to make sure that the IT that we procure, develop, and use is accessible to our faculty, students, staff, and visitors. That would include websites, digital documents, videos, and so forth, even software. We evaluate the software that we purchase to ensure that we purchase accessible products. And when we don't, to make sure that when we're stuck with a product that isn't as accessible as we'd like, to at least include in the wording of the contract that we sign that they will work with my IT accessibility team to make their product more accessible as time moves on. I also run the Do It Center, where Do It stands for Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology. That started in 1992 as I decided to what I called at the time, dabble in grant writing. But we've been very successful, primarily getting money from National Science Foundation, other federal agencies, state agencies, corporate, private funds, to direct a number of projects where we're all focused on improving the lives of people with disabilities. And our particular focus is on transition to college, graduate school, and careers, and a lot of work in the area of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, since we are funded so much by the National Science Foundation in the United States. We also started the Center on Universal Design and Education in 1999 and continue to support that. You'll find a lot of resources related to what I'm talking today at that location. I'll give you the URL at the end of the talk. So all of our approaches rest on social justice, the social justice model, where we think that it's important that, first of all, we have the right attitude about students with disabilities, that we should expect them to participate in everything that we do because they have a right to participate. We shouldn't be surprised when a student is blind enrolls in our course. We have given that quite a bit of thought already, and including taking an exam rather than rely on accommodations after they show up. When we're working with the students themselves, we work on self-determination, which is a broad range of skills and knowledge and information about resources and so forth that a student with a disability can use to contribute to their own success. But we spend an awful lot of time working with faculty and staff and industry and institutions of higher education, technology companies. And there we're promoting the concept of universal design. And this is the framework I'm going to be talking about today, which rests on social justice and can be used for a larger scale diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, which we have done as far as IT at the University of Washington. So I encourage people to think about diversity or think about ability rather than disability, because doesn't it really matter what we can do, not what we can't do? And everyone is on a scale. It isn't just a group of people who have disabilities and a group of people don't. Everyone is on a scale from not very able to very able on this continuum, double-edged arrow. And we can just take a look at characteristics we have. The ability to understand English, for example. A person might rate themselves toward the left-hand side of this scale, and it might be because they have a disability that impacts their ability to understand English, but it might be because their first language is not English. But the important thing is for us to know that there's a diversity of ability within any group when it comes to understanding English. Not so important exactly what the foundation is for that particular challenge that student might have. Social norms. We know that there are some disabilities that impact the ability of a student to understand social cues. They can learn them if taught them, but they don't pick up on the social cues like the average student. And so they may rate themselves low on the ability and that category. But it also might be because they've been growing up in a different culture and so not as familiar with the social norms of the culture they're now living in or taking a course in. Now we can go down this list and talk about the ability to see or hear or walk. We all are on this continuum. You can rate yourself right now mentally. Your ability to read print. We know there's great variety in that category. It could be read print that you can see, but it also might be you can't read print because you happen to have a visual impairment. To write with a pen or pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, and to learn. So there are all sorts of levels here, and we have a very large group with us today. And if we all rated ourselves and turned in our ratings, I doubt if there'd be any two that would be alike. And so let's kind of just think about diversity as being the norm in our assessments and other educational opportunities, not a difference or not a surprise. So the whole paradigm of universal design is that we should design our products and environments, and that can be educational products and environments, could be a course, could be an exam, could be a standardized assessment, and our environments, our maker spaces, our engineering labs, our dormitories, and so forth, usable by all people. It doesn't mention people with disabilities here, and that's an important thing to remember about universal design. It's all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So it's a way of thinking as I think of universal design. There are a lot of practices that have grown up under that umbrella, but it's a way of thinking that rather than think of the typical student that's going to take this exam or the typical student that's going to be in my class, what about if I just think of the great variety of characteristics students in my class might have? That could be ability, could be related to race, ethnicity, age, and any number of things. So again, I mentioned that this can provide a framework for all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There are unique issues for particular underrepresented groups, but they can be addressed under this broader framework because many of the issues they face, looking at them broadly, are the same between the groups, and that's an important thing to know. So this is from the Center of Universal Design in North Carolina State University. So let's take a look at technology just to give an example. Universal design of technology, we need to look no further than our smartphones. Our smartphones, we can change the size of the characters, we can change the color of the background. My phone talks to me. Actually, my phone talks to me way too much. I have more trouble turning my phone off than turning it on. But my son has an explanation for that. It's not very charitable. Anyway, but it's also important that technology is compatible with standard assistive technology that people with disabilities use. And there are thousands of these technologies, but I'll share through universal design that you don't have to know about all of them, but you have to know what they're capable of doing. For example, I like to think of 4 people that are taking my test or they're participating in my online class. I actually know these students because they've been in the Do It program. And so Anthony does not have a usable voice. He has a physical disability that doesn't make it possible to use a standard keyboard, but he can use an expanded keyboard with larger characters. He actually provides phone support at a high-tech company for people with disabilities using assistive technology. So Anthony needs to use a phone, of course. There are adaptations, so he's able to use his computing devices, his assistive technology, and type in his phone communications, and he has a computerized voice that will read that out loud. There are a lot of complicated technologies that Anthony could use and others who have that type of disability. But the main thing the rest of us need to know is he can do pretty much everything you and I can do with our computers, with a variety of technology, except one thing. Anthony cannot use a mouse. So what that means for developers, a developer of an exam, a developer of technology that we're using to display an exam, technology we're using in a course, it is important that we use technology that can be operated by the keyboard alone. And we can all test for that without trying the assistive technology. And you can just move your mouse aside, see if you can operate your website without the mouse. Typically, you'd be using your arrow keys to replace the mouse. And most technology is not fully operable with the keyboard alone. So that's the first thing we can learn. Jessie has multiple learning disabilities, and so she cannot, it's difficult for her to get her thoughts down on paper or to even type on a keyboard. And so she dictates to her computer, and she can dictate anything that we can provide using our keyboard. And then she likes to read what she has produced because she has a reading disability as well. And so at that point, if she's typing in the content, she can read that content and make edits. But when other people create content, let's say a PDF file for a syllabus, and it's not accessibly designed, then she can't access the content. So she can't use her screen reader to read that content aloud. And so we've created a barrier from her accessing that content. Adrian is deaf, and so unless he has accurate captions, he cannot access the content in videos. Often instructors put videos on YouTube and use the captions that are automatically created. Well, those are created as a draft, created by a computer, so we shouldn't be surprised that often the words are misspelled and there's no punctuation. What people don't realize that are putting their videos up, apparently, is that it's very easy in YouTube and other platforms as well to go in and edit your captions. And so correct the spellings and the punctuation. That will benefit Adrian, but it'll also benefit students who are English language learners who rely on those captions to understand the spelling of words and punctuation. It also benefits students with some types of learning disabilities where they can read the content as they hear it and will understand better. And the third person is Nicole. Nicole is blind. She uses a screen reader to access the content, much like Jessie, but unlike Jessie, she can't see the screen at all. And so it's important that those documents, including that PDF document I mentioned, are formatted in a way that her screen reader can tell her what is a heading and what is in a list and so forth. And so you can see you don't have to have a lot of detail about assistive technology to make some things work. It's already been mentioned, it's great if you test your products with people with disabilities, but you can do a lot of things before you get to that testing. There are things that are tried and true, been proven many times over to make your product accessible. And when you do that, taking a universal design approach, you reduce the number of accommodations you will need. Just as demonstrated in this image, where on the left, we have a large circle with universal design, and the accommodations are a large oval within. Where on the right, the same size circle of universal design has a much smaller oval with accommodations. That's because that particular iteration, they have been applying universal design. Notice that I'm describing these images. That's one of the important things about universal design. I have no idea if the 259 people that are participating today, if they can all see my screen. You may not be able to see my screen because you've turned that you're just listening by phone or whatever. You might be blind, and so you can't see the screen unless I provide it in accessible format and so forth. But I don't worry about that. I just make sure I describe the content so that everyone in the presentation today and other presentations I give has access to the primary content that I'm getting across. Now, there are 3 sets of principles that underpin universal design that can guide us in all aspects of education. Some people have heard of the second one, UDL, Universal Design for Learning. There are 3 principles that apply to curriculum and instruction. But before that, long before that actually, there were 7 basic principles of universal design that can apply to any product or environment, like the makerspace I mentioned earlier. There are the guidelines there, and it's not just about disability. For instance, one of the guidelines encourages you to provide space for ease of use by anyone using a product. And so you have a space for left-handed users in your computer lab, for instance, a comfortable space for them. Also, like in a service desk, having 2 heights, kind of a height for accessing your service by standing and another one sitting. This is important, particularly in my office at the University of Washington, because we employ people with disabilities in our programs. And if a student is at the counter who uses a wheelchair, it makes that interaction with someone that comes to the counter, even if they're standing up, but they can see over that shorter part of the counter. So we need to think about people working there. And that's what universal design is all about. You think about everybody. And then the last set is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they actually provide guidelines for developing accessible IT, and they're most widely accepted guidelines in the whole world, actually. So we have the universal guidelines, universal design, and then we have the WCAG and the UDL guidelines as subsets. And in my view, those are the only 3 sets of principles that we need. So there are 14 of those. But luckily, it's interesting to study them, but for a presentation like that, I can tell you what I gleaned from those principles. 3 principles or 3 guidelines provide multiple ways for your participants to learn and to demonstrate what they have learned, provide multiple ways to engage, ensure all technologies, facilities, resources, strategies are accessible to individuals with a variety of disabilities. And all 3 principles interact in various ways for these 3 guidelines. So universal design then, in short, it's an attitude. It's thinking about the diversity of our audience rather than thinking about the typical user. We can think about the typical user, but we don't stop there. Stop there. We can start there, but not stop there. It's a framework, and there's a whole framework you can get from our website and a book that's been recently published about it that's on our website. And it's a goal. We'll probably never reach it, but we should be shooting for it, and a process. So it supports social justice, it values diversity, equity, and inclusion of all groups, promotes best practices, does not lower standards, it's proactive. So we're thinking of things ahead of time, and benefits everyone, or almost everyone, and minimizes the need for accommodation. So why wouldn't anyone want to do that, right? Okay, so I love this quote because to me it speaks about universal design. And if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So we need to think about what we're asking our students to do. Is it really testing what we want to test? Okay, so as we look forward then, these are just a few tips, and there's kind of a light touch here, but we only have a few more minutes. So number 1, apply WCAG 2.1. Level 2 is what is often used as a standard, but there are 3 different levels. This is very technical once you get into the details, so that would be your webmaster or your software developer. If they know how to apply other rules and standards in developing software, web pages, etc., they can learn these rules. If you're not one of those people, it might look pretty techy if you go there. But that ensures that accessible technology, but also the text format, like in a PDF or a Word document, is accessible, and instruction your headings and things for people who are blind, and text descriptions for images, so a person who's blind and a screen reader user can read the content that is presented in those images. Use clear, consistent layouts and organizational schemes. Students with disabilities complain about this the most, and when they say their challenges in online learning. So some of the things are pretty simple. Use large sans serif fonts, uncluttered pages, plain backgrounds. I'm demonstrating that today. Avoid the need to distinguish between colors. This is particularly useful for people that are colorblind. Many people are colorblind. That's not a disability, but it's a diversity consideration. And so if you're asking people to select certain buttons, but they're all round, and you are saying choose the green one or the red one, don't assume that everyone would be able to do that. And so make those buttons different shapes as well. It's okay to have the color, but make sure that they don't rely on color alone. Provide multiple ways to demonstrate what they're learning. Address a wide range in language skills using plain English, avoiding or defining acronyms and jargon. Make instructions and expectations clear. Use examples relevant to a diverse audience. Allow adequate time for completing exams or tests. So those are just a few tips. And there are many more details, but what I'm encouraging you today is to look to the framework of universal design for all aspects of education as you try to define the practices within developing assessments. Also, if you're in charge or on a DEI effort on your campus or somewhere else, also look to universal design. If you look at the 3 sets of principles, they can guide those practices. And the Center for Universal Design and Education at uw.edu/DOIT/CUDE, you'll find some checklists, but also a book and other references that tell you how to implement the framework in an educational setting. A couple of other things that you could Google. There's a page on UDL and assessment that talks about the UDL part of this, and another one called UDL tips for assessments. So you can do a little Googling and find out some specific checklists that apply UDL. So thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and look forward to the next talk.
Thank you very much, Sheryl. That was fantastic. And I think one of the really interesting things is that what the last year has shown is that accessibility as well is much wider. Even, for example, I think one of the interesting points brought up in the chat window is about even just typing skills, with the move to like online assessment.
Yeah.
And that's like, can a person actually type in a way where you would actually be able to, say, conduct a fully assessment or an exam?
Yeah.
That's it. I think it's put a big spotlight on this whole area.
I think so. I think that's good. I think I should put that on my list.
There, you're absolutely not. Listen, that was a really fantastic presentation, and an area that I know from personally and even what we do in better examinations is just so key. And I think it's often, I think it's so important these days, but it's not just the technical standards. It's making sure that it's really getting people involved who can try out and test everything you're doing. No, really fast.